All right, well, it is 7:05, so welcome everyone to our meeting today. Hopefully by this time you've resolved any audio issues that you are experiencing, so we will get started. We just want to make a quick announcement in Spanish. For folks, we do have Spanish interpretation available. If you just switch over to the Spanish channel, so we'll make this announcement in Spanish as well. Bienvenido, si usted habla solo español, tenemos un intérprete disponible. Usted puede utilizar el chat para decirnos que el idioma que necesita, si necesita ayuda para acceder al canal de español. Puede también presionar el globo terráqueo abajo de su pantalla para acceder al canal en español. Alrighty. So thank you again for joining us. Today we are hosting the third public meeting for the Springfield to Quantico Enhanced Public Transportation Feasibility Study. I just want to give you a quick rundown of what to expect during this meeting. So we are having a Zoom meeting with a breakout room portion. During this meeting and anytime we're in the large groups portion of the meetings, you will remain muted. We have removed the ability for folks to unmute just so that we can keep some order during the large group. But once we do get into the breakout rooms, you will have the opportunity to unmute and ask questions since you're in a smaller group setting. Please raise your hand during that group if you want to ask a question. That way, again, we can keep an orderly discussion. The breakout rooms will be active for 20 minutes, and there will be a note taker in each of the rooms to capture the discussion. You're always welcome to use the chat feature, and if you can see at the bottom red arrow shows you where the chat is. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to enter them in the chat, and then we will answer them during the large group Q&A. And then we will go into the smaller breakout room discussions where you can unmute and ask questions either through chat or by verbally speaking them. All right, and now I want to hand it over to Tim from DRPT.
Yes, thank you, Diana. My name is Tim Roseboom, and I'm the overall project manager for this study. I want to just take a minute to acknowledge some of the other DRPT staff who are at the meeting and who you will be hearing from in some of the small groups. Todd Horsley is our Director of Northern Virginia Transit Programs. Jen DeBrule is our Chief of Transit, Jennifer DeBrule, and Seattle Williams is our Northern Virginia Transit Planning Manager. You already heard from Diana Barreto, and the rest of the consultant team, whom you'll hear from later, is there on the slide. I won't their names since you'll be hearing from them directly. Next slide. So this slide is showing an overview of what's going to be discussed tonight. As Diana said, this is the third public meeting for the Springfield to Quantico transit study. So you hear about an evaluation of alternatives that has been done, as well as a summary of the evaluation results. There's a sensitivity test that the consulting team performed on different scenarios. You hear a lot about a land use assessment that's been ongoing, and Seattle Williams DRPT is overseeing that. And then we'll finish with the presentation with next steps, we'll have a brief Q&A, and then we'll go into breakout discussions and then wrap up the meeting after that. Next slide. So this slide is depicting the study outcomes. I'll just read it directly from the slide. It's a comprehensive objective evaluation of a range of potential future enhanced transit alternatives that compares the cost, benefit, and impacts of each option to inform recommendations about future investments in the corridor. Next slide. So this slide is depicting the technical approach to the study. On the left side of the slide, the far left in the purple is the public and agency involvement, which is ongoing. In the middle left, in the red is the technical process of evaluation, testing and evaluation of alternatives. And then on the right in the green is the land use scenarios and the testing of the development and testing of land use scenarios that I mentioned. It's all leading up to a series of recommendations depicted at the bottom in the blue rectangle. and we'll be coming forward with those in October. I do actually want to mention at this point, there will be an opportunity to view for the public to review and comment on a draft report that's being produced. And then on the next slide, you'll see, so this slide is depicting the study schedule. We're in the red arrow section right now, alternatives development evaluation. We're in that second public involvement phase, and we're nearing the end of the alternatives development. So as I mentioned, we'll be bringing forward a recommendation or a series of recommendations, and we'll actually be producing a final report, and that report goes to the General Assembly. That report's due on December 1st of 2021. That, I believe I'm turning it over to Tom Harrington of Cambridge Systematics. So go ahead, Tom.
Thanks, Tim. So as we kind of review the evaluation results, I think before we do that, we wanted to just kind of refresh everyone's memory for those who participated throughout the process. Really, this process started with an evaluation of the transit needs in the corridor. This sets the stage for us to understand the problems that we're trying to address with enhanced transit. So from that work, which included analysis of data, it included our first round of public involvement, and looking at forecasts for the corridor, we identified 6 major categories of needs that the study is addressing. And so enhanced transit is needed because, and so we'll start with, first, there are places in the corridor where existing transit does not serve all trips well. It may serve many of the trips, and particularly commuting trips have good transit access, but other types of trips may not have that high quality transit connections. Transit services may need enhancements to support future development in the corridor. We'll talk quite a bit about that tonight. Transit can improve equity by connecting low-income and minority populations to opportunities. So we'll also talk a little bit about how we've analyzed how all folks can have access to transit within the corridor through enhancements. Transit connections to key regional activity centers such as Fort Belvoir and Quantico military bases are limited. And so that was something that we've looked at, is how we can improve connections to those bases. I think as everyone knows, traffic congestion, particularly in this corridor, is severe and continuing to get worse. And so transit provides an option or another choice for people traveling in the corridor. And finally, access to transit services is often reliant on park and ride in the corridor or longer walks to the bus. So we are looking for enhanced transit options that provide better access as well. So with that background, I'll take a quick look at the transit alternatives that have been studied throughout. And so there are 5 alternatives that have been tested. 2 of those are Metrorail extensions. And really the charge at the beginning of the study was to look at the corridor from Franconia Springfield Metro Station to Quantico. And so extending the blue line would start directly at Franconia Springfield and go down to Quantico. We also looked at a yellow line extension, which would start at the current terminus at Huntington Station and also extend south. We looked at a bus rapid transit option, as well as service improvements to VRE that's already in the corridor, and then also new and enhanced express bus routes. So just to quickly look at where those connections would be made. As described, the blue line would start at Franconia Springfield. It would, in the Fairfax County portion of the corridor, connect to both the Fort Belvoir North, as well as the main campus of Fort Belvoir, with kind of Newington in the middle there. Then kind of following the Route 1 alignment through Lorton. And then in the Prince William County part of the corridor, stations are envisioned at North Woodbridge. We've got 2 or 3 in the greater Potomac Mills area. They're landing at Prince William, Potomac Mills itself, and the Potomac Town Center on the east side of I-95. And then a little further south, the Southbridge Station, which is near the growing Potomac Shores area, and then Triangle, which is closest to the gate at Quantico. The yellow line extension that I mentioned, it follows the same alignment from Fort Belvoir south. The difference is that on the north end, it would start at Huntington and follow Route 1 or Richmond Highway down to Fort Belvoir. But in the Prince William County portion, it's the same alignment as the blue line extension. We looked at BRT as well, And this would build on the planned Richmond Highway BRT project, also in the Richmond Highway corridor there. So it would extend south from Fort Belvoir, follow Richmond Highway, and then in Prince William County would deviate from Route 1, heading west to the other side of 95 to serve the Potomac Mills area, and then come back or join Route 1 on the east side of I-95. And as you can see with bus rapid transit, the station stops are a little closer together than you get with a Metrorail type alignment. So that's why there are more stations in this alternative. VRE already operates in the corridor, and there's a new station, the Potomac Shore Station, that's been added. But what we actually looked at were enhancements even above and beyond what's already planned. So there's significant investment plan to VRE. A lot of that is going to happen. And so what we were looking at is, well, what if we increase service even more beyond what's already planned? So that's when we talk about VRE, we're talking about those additional enhancements beyond what's already planned. And then finally, Express Bus, looking at how you can use bus service to connect activity centers and places throughout the region. And this includes both new service, new routes, as well as enhancements to existing routes. So the new routes are connecting places like Quantico and Woodbridge with destinations such as Fort Belvoir, Tysons, Alexandria, Fairfax City, and Reston. So that was the fifth alternative that we looked at. So with that, for background information, I'll turn it over to my colleague Dahlia Levin, who will walk through the results.
Sure, thanks, Tom. Next slide. So for those of you who have joined us, perhaps for previous public meetings on this project, some of this will look a little bit familiar. So as Tom mentioned, we identified some of these needs in the corridor, and from that, we've developed 6 categories of goals for enhanced transit in the corridor. And these are focused on things like ridership potential, congestion mitigation, equity, regional accessibility and connectivity, cost effectiveness. So really making sure that resources are used efficiently, getting the most bang for your buck, as it were. And then the potential of these alternatives to create development opportunities in the community. And we did a much longer version of us talking about results and bar charts in July. But a couple of key highlights we wanted to go over with you guys again today. So the first one is looking at that ridership potential metric and really thinking about how many total transit boardings we have happening in the corridor. And so that's looking at every time somebody gets on a transit vehicle in our study corridor. And the results show that the BRT alternative has the highest number of transit boardings in our corridor, followed fairly closely by the 2 Metrorail alternatives, the blue line extension and the yellow line extension. And as you can see from the bar chart, where each of these colors is a different type of transit that exists in the corridor, as you can see, there is some shift between different modes of transit in the corridor on the alternatives, as the new alternatives may be providing faster or more comfortable or more convenient service for some people who are currently transit riders. They have a new option, something new that they can use. One of the other ridership metrics that we looked at, you can see on the next slide, is really understanding where the boardings on our alternatives are happening. And so primarily here, we're looking at the 3 sort of big investment alternatives, I'll call them. So first looking at the BRT, where we're looking at high ridership, really very high ridership on the north end of the corridor. So Beacon Hill, Hydla Valley, South County in Fairfax. But there's also some strong ridership in Potomac Mills and at Maroomsco. But we do see some low ridership much further south. So Triangle, Dumfries, Neabsco have some low ridership, sort of under 250 riders a day. Similar analysis on the Metrorail extensions. So we're seeing our strongest ridership, again, in the north of the corridor. So at Fort Belvoir North, we're seeing very strong ridership. At North Woodbridge, very strong ridership. But again, low ridership south of Potomac Town Center, particularly at the Triangle Station. Similarly, for the yellow line alternative that we looked at, again, we're seeing very high ridership in the northern section of Fairfax County, so Beacon Hill Road, Hydla Valley, but also really strong ridership again at North Woodbridge, and some pretty good ridership in Borton through Potomac Mills at Potomac Town Center, and again some ridership dropping off as we get south of that area. We also took a look at what we call new transit trips. And so new transit trips are really thinking about not every time somebody gets on a transit vehicle, but every time we sort of cause a person who wasn't taking transit before to use transit as their means to complete a trip. So what we see here is that the Metrorail alternatives, in particular the yellow line, creates the most new transit trips to and from the study corridor compared with that no build alternative. So we're seeing an increase in the yellow line of more than 20,000 new transit trips per day coming from the study corridor, and an additional 7,000 or 8,000 headed towards the study corridor. And instead of going over 20 additional bar charts with you tonight, what we're going to do is really quickly go over sort of a summary that you can see on this slide on some of the other performance metrics. If anyone wants to see all of the bar charts, I encourage you to look at the presentation from our July public meeting, where we have a great many of them. But a couple of sort of headlines here, you can see how the different alternatives are performing. So as we talked about on ridership potential, it's the BRT alternative and the Metrorail options that are scoring highest. Congestion mitigation, all of the alternatives are decreasing congestion somewhat on the roads in the study corridor compared with the no builds. And that's really up to a 4% decrease in congestion on those Metrorail alternatives are doing the best. In thinking about accessibility, here we're talking about who now has access to transit. So people who can walk to stations, people who can walk to stops. And in those cases, the yellow line and the BRT alternative are performing the best. They have the most people and jobs who are within a half mile of the transit. But the yellow line provides the biggest increase in access to jobs for people. And that's really thinking about how many jobs, how much economic opportunity people can get to within an hour on the transit system. We also took a look at equity from a number of different perspectives, but what we're looking at here is thinking about how many of those residents who are living near the transit stations happen to be part of equity emphasis areas. And these are areas that are highly high concentrations of low income and minority residents. And the BRT alternative has more than 45% of the residents near stations or residents of these areas. And the yellow line actually also performs the best at creating new trips for those EEA residents. And the last one here is cost effectiveness. This is thinking about both the capital construction costs and as operating costs to operate these things on an annual basis. We see that the additional express bus service, which we have not talked a lot about tonight, was the most cost-effective option. But even still, BRT is 3 to 4 times more cost-effective than the Metrorail alternatives here. And that's thinking about this from the perspective of a cost per rider. And so all of that's information that we shared with you last time, but we've heard some really interesting questions that we wanted to make sure we understood the answer to when we're thinking about the feasibility of transit in this study corridor. And so we performed a series of sensitivity tests, which were designed to answer or provide some guidance on these 3 important questions. So the first one is thinking about, can we make the alternatives more cost efficient? And thinking in this instance, particularly about shortening the alignment. The second question is considering uncertainty in long-range planning, particularly around our new normal and the potential for long-term changes to the number of people who are teleworking. And then also want to consider how would significant changes in land use in the corridor impact those ridership forecasts. So for the first one of those questions, we tested what we're calling sort of truncated alignments or shorter alignments of the two Metrorail extensions and the BRT alternative. And you'll remember that we just looked at the ridership by station, and all of the stations south really of Potomac Town Center had some very low ridership. And so we wanted to see if we could capture the majority of that ridership while saving some of the construction and some of the operating costs. So you can see what these look like. The blue line is shown on the left, the BRT on the right. The yellow line is truncated at the same place as both of these, just for the purpose of testing. So shortening the alignment did have some impact on transit ridership, as would be expected. So you can see here that the total corridor transit boardings go down slightly. So that's all the transit ridership in the corridor, go down slightly, about 4% for the BRT, but don't go down for the Metrorail alternatives. But we do see some decrease across the board in new transit trips in the study corridor. And what is going on here is for the Metrorail alternatives, by shortening the alignment, we're seeing some decrease in folks using those Metrorail alternatives, but primarily people are still able to, in many cases, drive to a different station. And so they're still able to access the Metrorail option and take it further north. And because the Metrorail alternatives has such high percentage of park and ride users, that's still a valid option for a lot of people. But the BRT option is a little less park and ride reliant and is significantly more focused on folks walking to the stations and having some shorter trips associated with that. So the BRT alternative does get a bit more severely impacted by those by that truncation. And so we'd want to take a look at where might be the ideal location to terminate a BRT alternative if that was pursued in the future. You can also see that it improves the cost per rider. So in this instance, negative is a good thing. So it brings that cost per rider down a little bit on the Metrorail alternatives, which is helpful. The next sensitivity test we were looking at was again related to long-term telework. So if, as you can see, you're in my house now. So everybody, a lot of folks have been teleworking fairly significantly over the last year and a half. And there's some evidence, surveys and other things that indicate that people might keep doing this into the longer term, even once the pandemic has subsided. And while we are looking at ridership forecasts for 2045, if we want to consider what the impacts of those things might be, what would happen if the significant increase in telework continued into the long-term future? If that 60 to 65% of regional workers continued to work at home and did not commute on a daily basis. So we looked at a couple of different scenarios on a range of what that teleworking option could be. And so you can see we had a low telework scenario in which we have less than half of people are teleworking just over 1 day a week, up to a high alternative in which more than half of people were working from home 1.5 days a week. And you can see from the ridership impacts on the right, there are some fairly significant impacts to ridership. And what this is saying is that if fewer people are commuting, then fewer people will be using transit, and in particular would be using these proposed alternatives. So on the far right, we're looking at those Metrorail alternatives, which you can see are impacted more than the BRT alternative by continued telework. And there's a couple of reasons for this, but the biggest reason is because the Metrorail trips tend to be longer, and they tend to be more office-based work trips. So folks heading into the district, heading up towards the Pentagon and other places like that. Whereas a lot of the BRT ridership is either for types of work trips that require you to be there in person, whether that's working retail, whether that's working education, whether that's working in the medical professions. And the BRT is serving a lot more non-work trips, right? Folks who are using the BRT to do their shopping, to do things like that. So there's actually less of an impact, we're predicting, on the BRT ridership than there would be on the Metrorail ridership. And then we also looked at one other sensitivity test, which I hinted at, and Aditya is going to get into a lot more detail after I'm done. But all of the tests that we've talked about up until this point have been using what's called the MWCOG Cooperative Land Use Forecasts for 2045. And these are land use forecasts about jobs and population that are agreed upon by all the jurisdictions in the Washington region. And so this sensitivity analysis was really focused on what if we deviated from those established cooperative land use forecasts, and what if instead we focus on a really transit-oriented development land use pattern by increasing densities around the station areas. And so we looked at two different versions on this. One of them is a Metrorail focused TOD. And so that's really intense development around just the specific Metrorail stations. And you notice there were about 9 of those in the alternatives. And then we also had a version that was slightly less dense development at the BRT stations, but it gets spread out over more stations because the BRT has more stations. And so what we wanted to understand is if the counties were to focus development at these transit-oriented developments, what might be the impact of ridership? Now, this isn't to say these are the right land use scenarios, and these are certainly not what is going to happen, but we wanted to understand what if, what were the possibilities there. And so on the next slide, you can see we added significant numbers of residents and jobs to the station areas in the corridors. And what we saw, as expected, I think, is that as we increase the land use densities around these stations, we're actually able to see very significant increases in transit ridership. So those 2 Metrorail alternatives that I talked about, in which we were focusing density at those Metrorail stations, saw significant increases in ridership, 1/3 to 2/3 of their ridership growing based on those alternatives. And the BRT option also saw almost 30% increase from that lesser TOD scenario that we talked about. So I think what we've learned here is that significant changes in land use can have significant changes in ridership. And what needs to be done next is figure out what does that future land use look like in the corridor. And I'm going to turn it over now to Aditya, who's going to talk a little bit more about what transit supportive land use could look like in the corridor.
Hey, thanks, Dahlia. So till now, we've been looking at a lot of numbers and percentages. So I kind of wanted to bring it to a bit of reality and show what we mean by TOD and what transit-oriented development can look and function like. So to remind everyone, this map on the slide kind of shows the activity centers that we started with. This was a result of analyzing existing land uses, demographic pattern, as well as reviewing previous studies, the adopted small area plans. And we kind of mapped where the activity is happening today in the study corridor. And then later on the next slide, we kind of narrowed down these activity centers to the stations. So we had 12 stations for the metro alternatives. And we kind of focused this land use analysis on 8 of them. Fort Belvoir North and Fort Belvoir, because they're military-based sites, we had little control of the kind of land use around them. So we didn't look at them for the land use testing. And then Beacon Hill Road and High-Blow Valley in the northern part of the corridor already has a lot of planning done for those station areas as part of the BRT project. So we focused most of our TOD work on stations kind of Lorton, Newington South. So these 8 stations along the corridor. So the idea is, what can we organize future growth in a TOD pattern around these stations? If you go to the next slide, so kind of stepping back, just to kind of explain a little bit what we mean by transit-oriented development. And the concept is really simple at its core. It's the idea that we can organize growth in a different format than what we see as a suburban sprawl that's auto-dominated. Can we organize growth that's around premium transit stations, whether it's BRT or Metro, and try and have a mix of uses such that most of everyday trips could be either in a walking distance within the TOD district, or the longer commute trips could be taken by transit, by walking or biking to the transit stop. So the idea is to concentrate residential, commercial, office, retail uses in a compact, walkable district around the transit station. The other thing we realize is not all the stations along the study corridor are the same. We don't want to kind of develop an idea that's kind of one size fits all. We understand that stations up north, even stations like North Woodbridge, are going to be very different than stations in Southbridge and Triangle area. So in our land use planning, we utilize the DRPT's multimodal design guidelines and assign certain place types that were associated with certain densities and kind of mix of uses to kind of account for this difference in different places along the corridor. And then in terms of TOD, beyond the land use and development, we want to understand that access and connectivity are critical elements of TOD. So having comfortable pedestrian and bicycle connectivity and access to the stations, to the surrounding neighborhoods, is key to kind of making sure that new residents, new employees, and current residents in existing neighborhoods have good access to the stations and other destinations. And the third critical part is the ability to make kind of plazas and parks that are placemaking opportunities to enhance community identity around these stations. Next slide. So just quickly wanted to kind of present a case study of transit readiness within the region, Dunn, Loring-Merrifield Station in the Mosaic District in Fairfax County. This is a good case study of transforming a suburban area into more walkable mixed-use development in a planned fashion. So this area, especially the Mosaic District, transformed the multiplex theater and the surrounding parking lots into a compact walkable mixed-use development. There's been a lot of mixed-use development around the station itself. There's a larger plan to convert kind of these auto-oriented arterial corridors in the area to more multimodal corridors with better pedestrian and bicycle facilities. Another kind of bigger aspect of this plan is to reduce the impervious surface, whether it's from surface parking lots or larger, older buildings, to kind of green infrastructure, whether it's new parks, bioswales, rain gardens, or green roofs. The critical aspect of kind of implementing a project like this is to think through innovative ways of tax increment financing or other public-private partnership mechanisms to enable kind of both public and private side of things to partner and participate in new infrastructure and new development. Next slide. So these two images kind of show the before and after, so to speak. The image on the left is the aerial in 2010 of this area in Dunn, Loring-Merrifield. The station is kind of up north, kind of the medium of I-66. And you see in 2010, we had a lot of park and ride surface parking lots, some vacant lots, industrial lots, and then further south of 29, we had the theater complex and a lot of surface parking. And then 2021, we see a lot of new development that's in this walkable compact form. It's mixed use. There's a network of streets that enhance walkability and bikeability. And then there's a plan to convert some of these larger corridors, 29 or Virginia 650, into more walkable corridors. So I think this is one model how we can kind of look at these stations along a corridor to kind of develop as in a TOD format. I think I'm handing back to Tom.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we just have a few more slides to wrap up here our presentation tonight. As we talk about particularly the Metrorail extensions, beyond some of the things we've talked about tonight, we just wanted to recognize that the types of extensions that we're looking at obviously would be a significant investment. These are very long additions to the current metro system. I think we had used this graphic in our July meeting. We're talking about 30 miles from the core, and actually when you look at track length, some of these extensions are over 40 miles that we're looking at. In our discussions, with Metro, a number one priority that comes up is core capacity. So the region already has a need to address core capacity, and any extensions must happen in the context of first addressing the core capacity needs. But in addition, there are legal and governance implications of adding Prince William County to the compact jurisdiction members. That's one aspect of these alternatives that the study is looking at, as well as the beyond the construction and the operations of a typical transit alternative. With Metrorail, there are also annual capital and operating budget subsidy contributions that all of the compact members make. And so that's another consideration that we're looking at. And just to close, just wanted to recognize that this is a feasibility study. And as Tim said in the introduction, we're trying to lay out the different benefits and costs, potential impacts of different transit enhancements. And really, this is a first step in a multi-step project development process. So as shown here, for projects that would be seeking federal funding for construction, there are a number of steps that need to be completed prior to FTA evaluation, rating, and approval. But probably most importantly is, since we've just touched on these different alternatives, would be providing enough information so that we get to a selection of a locally preferred alternative. In other words, consensus on the types of enhancements that are needed to move forward, to move the project into the long-range plan, and then ultimately seek a funding solution. So that's where we're going to stop in terms of the presentation, but we'll move now to the next part of our program, which is Q&A at this point. And we're going to ask folks to use, at this point, the chat box. As mentioned, we're also going to have breakout rooms where we can have one-on-one discussion as well.
Thanks, Tom. I do want to take a minute to acknowledge Senator Scott Servell. I saw him on the line. And Senator Servell, if you wanted to unmute, say something, I think this is an appropriate time for you to say something.
Can you hear me, Tim?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you all for all the work you've done on this. This study was authorized by the General Assembly in our last budget. Senator George Barker and Delegate Luke Torian worked very hard to get the money authorized to fund this study. And I know Delegate Torian's been working on this for 12 years, trying to get a look at getting some Metro down to Prince William County, and Senator Barker for about the last 8 years. And ever since I picked up Prince William County in 2015, I've been working hard to get this looked at. And everybody knows that if you look around Northern Virginia, all the construction cranes are around metro stations. That's where the growth is. It's where the jobs are going. That's where the future is. And we got to get more people off I-95, and we have to keep doing these long-range plans to lay the groundwork so that when we have the money, we're able to build these types of projects. And this study that we're doing today is a big part of that. And appreciate you all doing it. And I look forward to hearing what your final results were. And I hope we get a lot of good input tonight. So thank you for having the meeting tonight and all the good stuff we're doing with it.
Well, thank you, Senator Servell. I know you've worked really hard on it, and I appreciate, you've had a lot of interest in the study, and that's always encouraging. So I do want to just, if there are any, I didn't see any other elected officials, but if there are maybe some staff members or people representing an elected official's office, maybe you could just drop it in the chat and we'll acknowledge you. But I think we're at Q&A right now. And so I will just read, oh, sorry, did we lose? I'm going to start at the top. I think as Diana had said, we want you to drop questions in the chat. So the first question is from Jason Stoltz. It says, when looking at the Metro line and extensions, why did you put
Yeah, Tim, I think your audio cut out there.
well. It seems that people forget that the town of Quantico is off as well. Quantico is not just a base, it is a, I think, Tom or Dahlia, when you can maybe answer that from.
Sure. And Tim, I'm not sure you heard us or not, but your audio cut out something fierce right in the middle there.
Yeah, why don't we, Dali, before you continue, let's read the question out one more time and then answer it.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, supposing my audio is not suffering the same fate.
Sounds
So the question again, when looking at the Metro line extensions, why do you not put a station in the town of Quantico as well? It seems that people forget that the town of Quantico is surrounded by the Marine base. It is private property, isolated, and continues to get cut off. Bus routes were recently cut off as well. Quantico is not just a base, it is a Virginia town that is often left to fend for itself. So I think the short answer is that we couldn't put a station everywhere. We did talk to the jurisdiction, so the counties in particular, Prince William and Fairfax, about where seemed the most reasonable to test, again, for feasibility of this. So none of these are implying that these would be the final station locations by far. But to test for feasibility, we were looking at one station at that far end, far southern end of the corridor.
Okay, so next question, and I'm gonna turn my camera off, so hopefully that helps with my audio. The next question is from Mark Schlufer. Is it assumed that BRT will be in dedicated lanes engulfed by a 6-lane highway similar to the Main Street plan for Route 1 in Fairfax County? I think I'll ask Tom or Dahlia to answer that one as well.
I can take that one. Yeah, so I think at this stage of planning, while we looked at BRT and we did assume bus priority, I think some of the details about the design of what that bus rapid transit would look like are still to be determined. So generally, we did assume speeds that would assume some level of priority, but some of these decisions about whether it would operate in median or in the shoulder are things that'll be worked out later.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And the next question is also from Mark. Did any sensitivity tests assume reallocating general purpose lanes in current 6-lane segments for a 2 BRT 4 general purpose lane configuration? This would greatly decrease the cost and improve livability in the corridor. So I'll say, Tom, you can add to this, but we didn't really look at changing the configuration of any highway lanes. That wasn't really part of this study. So a BRT could be designed that way, but it wasn't something at this level in a study that we looked at. Tom or Dahlia, did you want to add anything?
That's correct.
Okay, and then another question about the TOD. I think we may have answered this, but it's also from Mark. Did TOD assume a 6-lane highway along Route 6? Sorry, Route 1. So since that's a TOD question, I guess Aditya, can you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same answer. At this level, we didn't really go to that level of detail. But I just want to acknowledge that, yeah, like as we saw in the case study, like looking at these wider corridors is going to be important, especially they function not as a barrier, but they are, safe crossings along and better pet bike facilities along them to have a cohesive TOD. So that's a part of TOD for sure.
Okay, thank you, Aditya. So the next question is from Jess Unger. It says, why was the VRE extension alternative so low yield for ridership? And that's a really good question, actually. So it may not look like there is a lot of VRE ridership out there. And when you're looking at sort of the increment of VRE over above what's already going to be built, which is everything that's in the Transforming Rail in Virginia plan. So that includes the Long Bridge, the 3 and 4 tracks through Alexandria and through Prince William County, and then all the service improvements associated with that. That's all included in the baseline, and that captures a tremendous amount of ridership. So the increment of service above that we tested really didn't draw a lot of ridership, but there is a lot of increased ridership in the VRE alternative over the base. So I'm seeing a nod from Dahlia. So I think
I'll
that answers-
just add in that it was about an 80% increase in VRE ridership between the existing ridership and that baseline that Tim is talking about from what's included in transforming rail in Virginia.
Thank you, Dahlia. Yeah, okay, so the next question is from Peter Voorhees. Could you explain how capacity associated with the Commonwealth CSX corridor acquisition factored into the VRE alternatives? So I think we kind of answered that. There are some other DRPT staff on the phone on the meeting. I saw Randy Selleck and Jen DeBrule. If either one of you would want to give a more technical answer, but as I was saying, the VRE improvements, they are included in the base, and that includes the Transforming Rail in Virginia, excuse me, is included in the base, and that does include the CSX acquisition, which makes that project. Okay, so
Yes, Tim, I think that wraps that up. I don't know that there's much more to add to that.
okay, thanks, Jen. Now I'm seeing two comments about my audio. So I sounds like it's better with my camera off, and I closed everything in the background. So hopefully we're okay. The next question is from Jordan Pascal. How long would a metro train trip from the proposed end of the line to the DC? And how does that compare to a more limited stop VRE or BRT alternative? So again, I'll ask Tom or Dolly, I think, who did the model.
Off the top of my head, I believe we had calculated an average runtime from the end of the line up to the start of the extension of about 51 or 52 minutes for the Metrorail options. I don't off the top of my head know how long that would be all the way into DC. And then I believe it's about an hour and a half into DC from Stafford County on the VRE.
Yeah,
That's off the top of my head.
Yeah, and the VRE runtime would be the same as it is today, because what we were looking at were frequency changes. So it would not be a time change for that.
And the BRT alternative, I believe we were looking at about an hour and 35 minutes from the far southern station. So if we were talking about from Triangle up to Fort Belvoir.
Right, so I'm still seeing audio problems. Tom or Delia, can you take over the next question? I'm going to try to call my phone, dial in from a phone. So it seems my audio problems are still occurring. So I think we're on Mark Schlufer again.
Sure, I'm happy to read the questions. So our next question is, what are the capital cost range for the alternatives, and what are the assumptions? Will Metro be underground or above ground, similar to Route 7 in Tysons? Tom?
Sure. Yeah, I think, again, as going back to kind of earlier comments, some of the specific details about above ground, underground, I think are future decisions to be made. I think when we were looking at costing, though, for say the Metrorail options, we did look at recent cost from the Silver Line extension as sort of instructive of what a typical cost per mile would be. So at this point, we're dealing just kind of at a high level, looking at how the different options compare at a unit cost, while recognizing that some of the specific design decisions will come later.
Okay. Our next comment is from Nick Ruiz, who said he would be interested to know if a hybrid expanded VRE and feeder bus alternative was considered. Transforming rail in Virginia will eventually allow for 15-minute or metro-like frequencies with a capital cost baseline that is already accounted for from other funding sources. The only capital cost associated with that alternative would be any incremental feeder bus, and station capital improvements. And his concern is that the VRE alternatives capital costs and ridership potential are being misrepresented when not considered in concert with enhanced local feeder bus service to stations. So there was, if I'm remembering correctly, some improved feeder bus service assumed in the VRE alternative that we looked at. That could certainly be enhanced further, for sure. And the question of the capital costs is related to, in the instance of the VRE alternative, is primarily related to new trains to improve frequency if we need them, which, as it turns out, are really very expensive new train sets.
Dahlia, this is Sue. And I just wanted to point out that we in fact had local bus service to all of the new stations and all of the VRE stations. So we made sure that there was a connection from the communities to the VRE stations and also to all of the new rail and BRT stations as well. And then going back to Quantico, we did have express bus services that started in the town of Quantico. And we also made sure that the town of Quantico was linked with local feeder service to the stations, the triangle stations and the stations that are down in the southern portion as well. So we wanted to make sure that we connected all of the major activity centers to those stations. So.
Thank you, Sue. And I see one last question. And that is, will any recommendations be made on what the counties, especially Prince William County, should be doing now to make Metro a remote possibility in the future? Tim, do you want to try and answer that? And if so, you'd need to come off mute. Okay, I'm going to assume that Tim's audio is still not working. And I will try to answer that one. So I think while we're not going to be making recommendations specifically about what the land use should look like in order to make this possible, I think what we've seen from the sensitivity test is that there's a lot that the counties, particularly Prince William County, can do with the land use around potential stations to make Metrorail in the county more feasible, more successful, and more cost effective, if that was the direction that the county decided to go.
Hey, Dahlia, can I just add real quick?
Yeah.
So, when we were looking at the previous studies and adopted small area plans, there are a lot of great plans that Prince William County and Fairfax County are working on. So the question would be like, what are the mechanisms and processes where some of the recommendations that are already identified and adopted in the small area plans can be implemented with Metro or with BRT or some other form of transit. So there are a lot of good ideas that the counties are already working on and have been adopted.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for the great questions here that were dropped into the chat. Why don't we start with the main session? And I think the lead note taker in the main session, it was Tammy Lee. Tammy Lee, can you please share?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So our discussion was led by Tim Roseboom and Tom Harrington, and made a couple of good points, but I'm going to share with you 3 of the main takeaways. The first one was to really consider the reconnecting of the bases to the city of Quantico, especially through bus service. Because of various past changes, the base has been cut off from the city. So reinstating that connection would be really helpful with job access. Another point that we talked about was the possibility for a WMATA branch or line or a ferry over the Potomac to connect to the Metro extension. We recognize that this is outside the current scope for this particular study, but other studies for ferries and access over the river have been done. And then the third thing I'd like to share is that there was the need for clarification that the bus line for the VRE, the baseline, sorry, for the VRE includes improvements that are already planned. So any of the benefits will be above and beyond the already planned activities for the VRE. So I think that's all I have for the main points. Tom or Tim, would you like to add anything else?
I think you got it. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Tamili. And I think for our small group that was in the breakout room, Laura Van Wert, you're the lead note taker for that. If you could please share.
Yeah. Hi, Diana. So we talked a little bit, we had some folks that were interested in the BRT, particularly how it would impact Prince Williams County, concerns about cost, expanding highways versus, widening Route 1, for instance. We talked about, the TOD and what that would look like in Prince Williams County, and what it does that increase development in the corridor? Does it seem feasible? And then we just had a general discussion about, how long it takes for these plans to be put in place, that this isn't, this is the very beginning of this feasibility study is the very beginning of years and sometimes decades of things being put in the works. Did I miss anything? Those who were in my room?
No, you,
No, I think the only other subject would have been with the BRT is thinking about how we can design some of the roadways and design a BRT that's also transit oriented. One of our points of discussion as well.
Yeah, thank you, Delia.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing back what we heard in each of the rooms. At this point, I don't know if Tim is available to do a wrap up. He may still be having some audio issues. So I will just wrap it up for the group here. So a reminder that the draft report will be completed in October and that the final report will be submitted to the General Assembly by December 1st, 2021. At that point, I think the report will also be available for folks to provide comment on. If you've attended one of our meetings and said that you wanted to be kept up to date on the progress of the project, you'll likely receive an email when that is available for you to view. We will keep that list updated, especially up to this meeting specifically. Todd or Tom, if either of you want to say something else to wrap up here, I think we are at the end of our meeting.
Hey, this is Todd. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Great. I'll just, I think Tim is having some audio issues. So I'll just want to thank everyone for your participation tonight. We really appreciate it. This is the final, tonight and Thursday night, this is the final public meetings that we're going to have on this study. We will have one more opportunity for comment when we put the report onto the website. We will open that up for a public comment period. But again, these are our final two public meetings. And I do want to say, Thursday night, we're actually going to have the meeting is going to be the same content as it is tonight. You're welcome to come back and join us again on Thursday night, but also wanted to just let you know that so you didn't think that it would be a different content for that meeting. So again, just that's all I have. I just want to again thank everyone for coming and hope you have a good evening.
All right, yes, thanks everyone. My audio issues have been solved. So thank you, everyone. Apologize for the audio. Hopefully it goes better on Thursday night.
Awesome. All right, well, the meeting is now adjourned.